Every one of you sitting here, whether you're saved or lost, every one of you is exercising faith right now. You probably never even thought of it. You are trusting those chairs. Faith is natural to people. We all have faith, and we put it in various things. You trust your car. Faith is not a gift. Faith is not a gift.
Hello, Jeff Dollar here once again. I'd like to speak on the topic of total depravity. This will be our second video. I'd like to pick up where we left off the last time. Last time we examined the event that put man in the condition that he's in right now. That is the fall of man, the inherited sin nature. Adam as our federal head, our representative in the garden. When he failed, we also failed, and we sinned in Adam. It's one of those mysterious things, but nevertheless, it's something the scriptures speak about. And we are all then under the curse of death. Men are not sinners because they sin, but they are sinners because they sin because they are sinners. It's part of their nature. So we discussed that last time. In this video, I'd like to look at some of the effects of the fall. What we're going to do is follow it historically from the fall and then up to the New Testament or somewhere in that vicinity. We're going to try to go through history with the time that we have, examining the effects of the fall. One problem to introduce this topic, problem that modern religious people have, is that they give a much too high of a position to man, a much too high of a view of man, and a much too low of a view of God. And the reason is that, of course, we do not see this concept of depravity in the fall. Religious men like to think highly of themselves, that they are better than what they are, that they're able to do more than what they can do. And actually, there's something to consider, that fallen men, are in many ways worse than demons. Take a look at Luke chapter 4. We have the temptation of Jesus in the wilderness by the devil. He comes back from that. He is beginning his ministry. And in verse 14, he returns to Galilee to speak in the synagogue of his hometown. You'd think that the people would be glad to see him, and apparently they were. I believe that many people turned out. He was a great prophet. He was known all around for his teaching, and I would imagine his miracles as well. And so people were there to hear him. He goes into the synagogue, and he reads. He reads Isaiah chapter 61, verses 1 and 2. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor, and so on. So Jesus reads this portion of Scripture, which is a messianic passage. He then points out to the people of his hometown that today this Scripture is fulfilled in your hearing. It's verse 21 of Luke chapter 4. Jesus is saying that I am the Messiah. I am the fulfillment of this Scripture. Now you think, wow, this is wonderful. Here we have the Messiah coming from our own hometown. That wasn't the case. They asked the question, don't we know him? Don't we know who his parents are? We know his brothers and sisters. We know all about him. How can he be the Messiah? And they rejected him. Jesus then used two illustrations where God blessed Gentiles, and one was the widow of Zarephath, and the other was Naaman the leper. These were both Gentile people who came to believe, and they were blessed. Though there were many widows that existed in that time period with Elijah. This caused a great uproar among the people of his hometown in the synagogue. How dare he point this out, that the Gentiles were blessed instead of the Jews? And then they decided to kill Jesus. They took him out to the brow of a hill. They were with the intent to throw him down and kill him, throw him off the cliff. He just simply passed through the midst of them. Now, how he did that, we're not sure. There's some supernatural thing. Either they were too afraid to touch him, or they were blinded by God. I'm not sure. That's not something I've looked into. Nevertheless, here you have humanity, human beings who are in the midst of Messiah, who are hearing Messiah, able to touch him and see him, and they desire to kill him. You go a little further down the chapter to verse 31. Jesus goes to Capernaum. He finds in Capernaum, in the synagogue, verse 33, a demon-possessed man. This demon recognizes Jesus, and he addresses him. He addresses him in a very respectful manner, that he is the Holy One of God. The demon recognized who Jesus was, and then the demon begged not to be destroyed. Please don't destroy me. So you see the difference here. Man, in his fallen condition, his depraved condition, wants to destroy the Messiah, hates the Messiah, insults the Messiah. Demons, on the other hand, address the Messiah with the proper title, the Holy One, and then they cringe in fear, begging not to be destroyed. So in that sense, you have demons being better than fallen men. So man in the image of God rejects the Son of God as something common, tries to kill him, but demons bow down and beg not to be destroyed. This illustrates the condition of fallen man. Fallen men are blinded, completely blinded to spiritual things. We'll get into this later, I believe, in our next video. Because with this video, I want to get more into the history of it. But demons, however, see spiritual reality, and therefore do not dare cast the insults at the Son of God. When you go from the fall of man to the flood, you find that God has his hand of restraint removed from humanity. Genesis 6:5, then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Verse 6, the Lord was sorry that he had made man. Verse 7 says, I will destroy man. So then what happens? Verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. Noah found grace. God decided to save Noah, showed grace to Noah, and thus humanity is spared through Noah. God, had not he intervened and showed grace to Noah, all of mankind would have justly been destroyed. After the flood, within a few years, humanity was right back to where they were before. They were given over to idolatry, to violence, to sexual perversion. They had forgotten God. By the time you get to the Tower of Babel, they're building a tower to raise up their own name. But what saved God? What saved humanity there? Did some of them use their own free will and decide, guys, this isn't such a good idea? No. After the Tower of Babel, God intervened once again by calling Abraham out of his country. Genesis chapter 12, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land I will show you. Had not God intervened, God could justly have destroyed them right there as well. Think about mankind right after the flood, just a few years after the flood. You have the Babylonians, the Medes, the Persians, the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, all these great empires and great peoples, all totally given over to idolatry. Occasionally you find among the patriarchs, you find a believer here and there, such as Melchizedek. You have Job and perhaps others. But at the same time, the world is given over to idolatry, to hatred of the true God, to serving self. That is the natural condition of man. If God does not intervene, man goes on in his sin and will destroy himself. All of the nations of the world are corrupt, and without the specific intervention of God, will be destroyed. So what is the condition of natural man? In my flesh dwells no good thing. There's nothing that the flesh can do to benefit the spirit whatsoever. Romans chapter 7 and verse 5. man deserves nothing from God but his just wrath. So the question is then, are we to assume that man, in this natural state, which we have seen the whole way through the Scriptures, which is, unless you have God intervening, either you have him intervening at the flood with Noah, at the Tower of Babel, after the Tower of Babel with the patriarchs, with Abraham, had God not intervened, called out a people for himself from the flood with Noah, and then after the Tower of Babel and the establishment of the nations with Abraham, had he not done that, mankind would have simply gone on in idolatry and unbelief. So then, in light of the condition of man as we've seen throughout the Scriptures, biblical history, as well as extra-biblical history, if you look at the history of Europe, you see how paganism completely overwhelmed the Europeans. It was not until the missionary work of Christians where you have any change in that society. Historically, unless God intervenes, man has never been able to rise above that spiritual stupor of death, that spiritual death. He's always returned to a state of idolatry and godlessness. That is the natural condition of man. Man, therefore, deserves nothing but the just wrath of God. We see that all through the Scriptures. We see it all through history. That being the case, next time I'd like to look into the effect on, or what effect this has in the response, man's response to the gospel. Isaiah chapter 64 and verse 7. And there is none that calleth upon thy name, that stirreth up himself to take hold of thee. For thou hast hid thy face from us, and hast consumed us because of our iniquities. This is the state throughout Scripture, that man, unless God works, is content and very happy to remain under that spiritual stupor. So we look at this idea of total depravity. This is what we're talking about, that it takes a work of God to awaken a man to his spiritual need. He does not do so by nature. I believe that the Western world is confused by these ideas because of the great amount of light that it has experienced over the centuries, over the millennia. That because we have the gospel everywhere, the Bible everywhere, we assume that the whole world is like that. We've experienced great revivals and great works of God, but the whole world has not experienced that. The world, in its depravity, will remain so unless God works. We'll look into that next time, a little bit more detail. Once again, I'd like to thank you for your time, and may the Lord bless you in your search for truth.